It's me, you're watching this channel. And today we're exploring what may be the greatest battle ever fought, the Battle of Actium. We've all heard about the last battle of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, in which the Egyptian queen famously took her own life rather than be captured by Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. But that famous story only tells half the tale. Their defeat wasn't merely at land but also at sea, where over 2,000 ships engaged in one of the largest naval battles in antiquity. It was a conflict of fire and fury, but it was also marked by shocking betrayals, narrow escapes, and even divine intervention. In the summer of 32 BC, Cleopatra's fleet was sailing from Kos to Italia on the Syrian coast, escorting her lover, Mark Antony, back to Egypt. They had been on campaign in the east, trying to stop Octavian from invading their realm, and now they were bringing their army home. The force consisted of 1,800 Egyptian warships and 200 transports carrying troops, provisions, and artillery. This flotilla was supported by 2,000 cavalrymen riding on horseback on the upper decks of the transports. Their escorts were primarily composed of dromons, the backbone of the Ptolemaic navy, modeled after the classic Greek design. These ships were typically 200 feet long, though some were much larger. They were equipped with a single bank of oars on each side, driven by slaves chained to their benches, and they carried between 30 and 40 elite soldiers for their boarding actions. But their main weapon was their rams, large bronze structures built into the ship's prow that were designed to smash through enemy vessels and sink them. To increase the damage caused by the ram, the Egyptians would often coat theirs with iron or bronze, and some were even fitted with sharp hooks to snag and pull enemy ships toward them. But all these warships were at risk of being undone by just a few dozen Roman galleys. Now, if you've ever watched Gladiator, you know how effective a Roman galley could be. They were swift, maneuverable, and could deliver devastating blows with their hooked rams. But while Hollywood depicted them as monstrous killing machines, in reality, they looked more like Viking longships, sleek and fast, but armed with rows of small arms. In fact, most Roman warships weren't even equipped with rams, relying instead on their nimble fighting ships to board and capture their foes. Despite their enemies' advantages, the Romans had made a fatal miscalculation. The Egyptians outnumbered them nearly 10-1, and most commanders would have opted for a straightforward attack. But Octavian wasn't most commanders. His plan called for his fleet to split into 3 columns and lure Cleopatra's ships into a choke point near Actium. There, the narrow waters would prevent the use of the dromons' oars, forcing the Egyptians to rely on their sails alone. Then the Roman cavalry would charge in and cut off their escape. It was risky, but if it worked, it could annihilate the entire Egyptian fleet. When Agrippa, one of Octavian's best friends and most trusted commanders, presented this plan to him, he liked it so much that he ordered every vessel in his fleet to be outfitted with torches, lit them on fire, then sailed them directly toward the center of Cleopatra's fleet. The tactic was brilliantly simple. If Cleopatra's fleet didn't move, they would be trapped and boarded by the Romans. But if they tried to flee, they'd be funneled right into the waiting arms of the rest of Octavian's fleet. He had given them no choice but to destroy them. As the flames approached, Cleopatra hesitated. She knew that she couldn't win a direct battle with the Romans, so she prepared her fleet for a fighting retreat. Her flagship, the 600-foot-long Astralia, or Starry One, had been outfitted with nets to catch any grappling hooks used by the Romans and hooks of its own to drag enemy sailors onto the deck. Each ship in her fleet had been reinforced with extra gunwale to protect against boarding, and her smaller, faster ships were loaded with javelins, slings, and archers to bombard the Romans before they could get close enough to board. It was a good plan, but it didn't account for the surprise appearance of one of Cleopatra's own. Her fleet was protected by 2 squadrons of warships. The first, known as the Sacred Band, consisted of 140 ships captained by her most loyal officers, and behind them, defending the rear of the fleet, were another 70 ships captained by her lover, Mark Antony. But both men had become victims of their own paranoia. Fearing that one of them might make a deal with Octavian and save himself, they'd sent their ships to the front of the fleet, exposing the vulnerable transports full of troops and supplies to the oncoming fire. Even worse, one of Cleopatra's lieutenants, the General Ptolemy, had decided that the safest place was on the flagship with her. But as the Romans loomed closer, so did danger. The Alexandrian pharaoh had unwittingly stacked her entire fleet too closely together, allowing the fires to spread from ship to ship. And now the entire Egyptian fleet was in chaos, enveloped by flames. Cleopatra survived the initial assault, but she lost everything else. Her forces, along with those of Mark Antony, were defeated. All around her, Egyptian ships burned and sank, some too crowded to allow their passengers to escape, others too badly damaged to stay afloat. Men jumped into the sea, desperately swimming toward the life rafts provided by the Romans, only to be killed by the Egyptian archers defending the water. In the end, the battle came down to one of 3 ships, Cleopatra's flagship Astralia, and the 2 vessels occupied by her lover, Mark Antony, who had finally realized his mistake in sending all his ships to the front. He abandoned his post and raced back to help his queen, but he was too late. While the Astralia was still afloat, Cleopatra had already fled. She escaped in a small boat with a few hand-picked companions, including her sister Arsinoe, her general Ptolemy, and of course, Mark Antony. They sailed away from the battlefield, away from the burnt hulks of the once great Egyptian navy, away from the cheers of the Romans and the anguished cries of their prisoners. To understand why she fled, we need to look at what happened next. The Astralia was caught in a storm, battered by waves as tall as houses, and buffeted by winds that threatened to rip her sails to shreds. As the seas grew rougher, and the skies darker, Cleopatra became frightened. She began screaming at her helmsman, ordering him to turn back, to race back to Actium and defend her honor. But then something miraculous happened. Just when the ship seemed about to break apart, the storm suddenly stopped. The wind died down, the rain clouds parted, and the sun peeked out from behind the gray clouds. In the distance, Cleopatra saw an island. And there, standing on the shore, was a man unlike any other. He was tall and handsome, dressed in white robes and holding out his hand in greeting. As Cleopatra reached the beach, she recognized him. It was the god of the Nile, the Egyptian god Hapi, come to rescue her and take her back to Alexandria. But her companions weren't so lucky. When Hapi offered his hand to Mark Antony, he refused it, seeing the god not as a savior but as an obstacle. He unsheathed his sword and charged. Hapi raised his hand and struck Antony with a bolt of lightning, killing him instantly. He then took Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe, and threw her into the sea where she drowned. Finally, he turned to Cleopatra and said, "You are coming with me," and she went willingly. Some versions of the story say that she was placed in a temple and made a priestess, living out the remainder of her days in service to the gods. Others say that Hapi took her back to Alexandria, where she continued to rule as its queen. Regardless, the last years of her life were spent in safety. She was never captured by Octavian and executed as her history has often been portrayed. Instead, she lived on, hidden away in Egypt, spared from the world she once ruled, spared from the empire Octavian would soon build, spared from a fate worse than death. And I am spared from having to tell you the same stories you've heard 1,000 times before. Thanks for watching.